Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Wallace Collection. My name's Keith Dowen. I'm the Curator of Arms and Armour here. And today we're going to look at a subject which hasn't received a lot of attention over the years, and that is the Arms and Armour of Childhood. Just to mention that there will be about 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. For those of you in the room, there'll be a microphone passed around, so if you could wait until you have the microphone, just for the benefit of people who are listening online. So, as I've just said, the subject of arms and armour in childhood is one that has really not had a lot of attention over the years. In fact, the last exhibition and publication on the subject was back in 2003 at my old place of work at the Royal Armouries, although this display was at the Tower and I was based in Leeds. You do find arms and armour for children mentioned in catalogues and occasionally in essays, but there has been a real lack of any deep analysis. And the question is, why? And I think, well, part of the reason is that compared to armour made for adults, there are relatively few pieces. In the past, swords, for example, have been dismissed either as toys or possibly as daggers, very long daggers. And another reason that somebody the other day said to me that was interesting is when he had seen armours made for children, he thought they were test pieces for armourers, and they were just to show an armourer's skill and they were not meant to be actually worn. But I think the other reason is that these pieces of arms and armour don't have the glorious history attached to them as, say, an armour of Charles V or a musket that might have been presented to Napoleon in the early 19th century. And people like objects with rich stories. And the arms and armour of childhood seem to lack that. But actually, once you dig under the surface, you find that that's not the case at all. And actually, the role of arms and armour in society and in shaping particularly masculine identity can't be overstated. As Wordsworth said, you know, the child is father to the man, and that exactly applies to arms and armour as well. So the aim of this talk is to briefly outline the prominent role of arms and armour the role of arms and armour in the lives of elite children and how it shaped their identities. Now, although this mainly applies to boys, girls too had weapons made for them, and women took a prominent role at times in masculinizing their young male relatives. Now, boys and girls could be gifted weapons or armour at any age, but they seem to be associated with children reaching specific milestones in their lives, such as when they left the household, the female household, when they reached puberty as part of a betrothal, an alliance, things like that. So they're always associated with something in particular. Now, of course, as any parent today will know, and I'm including myself in that, when you buy clothes for a growing child, they don't last very long at all. And so to us, the idea of investing a lot of money into a very richly decorated armour, the one on your right, costing £200 in 1606, which was a phenomenal amount of money, seems counterintuitive. But people at the time didn't think of it like this. These objects were very much an investment for the future. So before we start, I think it's important to clarify what we mean by childhood. Now, there have been a number of publications in recent years exploring the nature of childhood in history and precisely when children crossed the threshold into adulthood. Now, during the Middle Ages, one of the most well-known schemes is the 7 Ages of Man. And this could be divided into early childhood, which was 0 to 7 years, childhood, 7 to 14 years, adolescence, 14 to either 21 or 28 years, depending on who you read, and perhaps surprisingly to us, youth, from 21 or 28 to 50 years, maturity 50 to 70 years, and old age 70 plus. Now, in the past, living to old age was quite a rare achievement. For other authors, though, life was divided much more into 3 stages, so childhood and adolescence together, childhood, then adolescence and youth, and then either maturity or old age. But this was all very theoretic, as it is today. You know, some children have are more precocious and age quicker than others, and it was the same in the past. So today, for example, we would technically call somebody 17 years old as a child, but that 17-year-old might be able to go and fight in the army, for example. So the terms are a bit loose, and so I'm not sticking too rigidly to them. It's interesting, though, that for a lot of individuals in the Middle Ages and Renaissance, the ages of about 18 to 21 was seen as when a boy became a man. The picture on the right shows an image of Veit Schwarz, who illustrated his various clothing in the mid-16th century. And in this particular picture, when he was 18 years old, he said that he started wearing his sword in daytime now that he was an adult. Philip II was presented with his first adult garniture at the age of 17, and the distinguished French soldier Blaise de Montluc wrote in his memoirs that at the age of 20, which was in 1522, he had, quote, now grown up towards man. So for the purposes of this talk, I'm really going to be cutting childhood off at around the ages of 18 to 20. So although the basic function of arms and armour was practical, either providing protection or inflicting bodily harm, arms and armour have always fulfilled other roles. And armour, particularly high-quality armour, was extremely important in fashioning an individual's identity in precisely the same way that clothing had. It acted as a cultural signifier. It could convey the wealth, status, personal beliefs, and aspirations of the wearer. What's particularly interesting is that it could be used actively to give the wearer an even greater status than they actually possessed. So in that way, arms and armour not only reflected status, it also created it. And weapons also served as status symbols, and I think, you know, the one that everyone thinks of is, of course, the sword. And this was a potent symbol of both physical and sexual power, and those believed to have belonged to legendary figures like Roland from Charlemagne's reign, almost functioned as secular relics, bestowing something of the power and charisma on the new owner. Armour and weapons, I think it's important to say, were not approximations of the equipment available to adults, but they were faithful to them in construction, form, and decoration. And even the most elaborately decorated armours are mechanically sound. Now, the reason for this is partly obvious. Trying to learn how to fight and wear armour, for example, you need to be able to fight, you need to be able to wear the real thing. There's no point in having your movements greatly restricted or trying to learn how to shoot a gun if the gun actually doesn't shoot. It's also important that they were functional and smaller replicas of adults' arms and armour, because to wear anything other than a real object or carry a real object was, in a sense, to create a counterfeit and therefore inferior identity. Another fascinating role of armour is its importance in shaping a person's physiology and also psychology. It was extremely important during the Middle Ages and Renaissance, and you find this in literature of the period, for noblemen to have a noble or courtly body, which elevated them above other boys and men, and one which actually carried very significant and real political weight. So much like girls in the beginning of the last century, in the 19th century, was taught deportment by walking around with a book balanced on their heads, in the same, armour functioned the same way, in that it taught boys how to stand with a correct posture and learn how to move. And that would become so ingrained that when you weren't wearing the armour, you would still act and move in that way. Furthermore, armour could act to hide any type of deformity. And most recently, that's been exemplified by the work on Richard III's armour. But you also find it in Plutarch, who describes Pericles as having an unusually large head, which his helmet serves to partially hide. And this sense of decency and looking right and looking pure was extremely important. Your physical appearance was thought to reflect the purity and nobility of your soul. So if a child did have some kind of physical defect, armour can, because it is so well engineered, help to cover that up and thus create a more knightly and even a semi-divine body. I think it's really interesting that it's been convincingly argued in the last few years that while femininity is automatic to girls, masculinity is something that has to be acquired by proving oneself in the eyes of other men. And this ideal of being masculine, hardy, tough, and resilient in the face of danger has been long established. And during the Middle Ages, the ideal man was epitomized by heroes such as Roland, which gave rise to the notion of the upright man, which every male aspired to. And during this period, violence particularly became a test of manhood. The humanists, Erasmus, for example, and Thomas More reacted against that a man didn't have to be defined by violence, but nevertheless, violence remained an important part of his life. And even, Shakespeare also mentions it in Romeo and Juliet. He has Samson saying, "Draw your swords if you be men." So in short, arms and armour had the ability to at least visually transform boys into men. Now, normally, boys didn't actually begin formal martial training until they had reached puberty, which was around the age of 12 to 13. But that didn't mean that contemporaries didn't attach a lot of importance to teaching them martial skills at a younger age. Edward, 2nd Duke of York, in the 14th century, in his book The Master of Game, wrote, "A craft requires all a man's life ere he can be perfect thereof. And also men say that which a man learns in his youth, he will hold best in his age." So to begin with, learning martial training was introduced very much as a part of normal play. And for older children particularly, this involved engaging in activities which would teach them useful skills that they could draw on later in life. We all know that children learn a lot through imitation, and the same was true in the past. And this involved mimicking the martial activities of older male relatives. In its most basic form, it might involve playing with a blade of grass or a sedge to imitate a sword. I'm sure a lot of us have picked up a stick in the woods when we were younger and we pretend it's a sword. You could ride hobby horses, and you could learn jousting by having long sticks with a windmill on the end. And the faster you move forward, the faster the windmill turns. Wrestling was also another popular sport among men, and most famously it was put into practice at the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520 between Henry VIII and Francis I, who both would have learned those skills during childhood. Now, for particularly wealthy boys, you could play with model knights, just like we do today. But they were not only visually stimulating, they were also educational. And these knights on the right of the picture were produced in around 1505 under the direction of the Emperor Maximilian, who commissioned pairs of toy knights for his grandsons Charles V and Ferdinand I. Now, these particular figures are armed for the joust of war, which was a very popular sport at Maximilian's court. The figures are mounted on wheels, so they can be either pulled or pushed together, and each of the figures has a long stick imitating a lance through the arm, and actually when the figures come together, they pivot and fall off, just as they would do in real life. So not only would this have enabled young boys who, if we're talking about Charles and Ferdinand, were 5 and 2 at that time, to reenact the joust that they would have seen at their grandfather's court, it also taught them basic fundamental principles such as cause and effect. Philip II had a, quote, silver knight with full armour and a silver horse for the said knight, and that was purchased out of the monthly early allowance that his father Charles V gave to his tutor. And this would have introduced Philip to important things like the mechanics of armour and how it's worn. So although play was encouraged, it was also circumscribed with the type of play regulated to the child's age. So older boys would not be expected to play necessarily, be expected to play with toy knights, although undoubtedly they probably did. Now this is a really interesting portrait of Prince Baltasar Carlos by Velázquez, and it shows the 3-year-old boy. He's wearing a gorget, which is armour for the neck, which, for those of you in the room, I'm using my laser pointer to point it out. He has his hand on a sword, another on a baton, so he's very much in the style of a contemporary military figure. But what's really interesting is he's handing his toy rattle and an apple, which simultaneously represent the orb and scepter, to a dwarf who is leaving the frame. And this symbolizes him entering a much more masculine world. And I'm sure quite a few people are familiar with the quote from the Bible in Corinthians: when I was a child, I spoke as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child, but when I became a man, I put away childish things. So as evidenced from an armour at the Musée de l'Armée in Paris and from household accounts, we know that boys could begin wearing armours for as young as 4 years old, although, as we'll see, the usual age was about 6. Now, this particular armour was made in Flanders or France in around 1625, and it's the armour of a heavy cavalryman or a cuirassier who wore 3/4 armour and was armed with a pair of pistols. This is very much the latest style of armour worn in the 17th century. So learning to wear and move armour took time to become accustomed to. It was not something you could easily pick up over a couple of days. And of course, with elite boys, having access to armour at a very young age meant that they had an even longer period to get used to learning how to wear it. There's one 15th century romance, for example, in which the protagonist insists on fighting an abbot in armour, but the abbot is hesitant because it's something that he's not accustomed to doing. Weapons were also introduced at a young age, and probably quite shockingly for us, Louis XIII fired his first gun at the age of 3 years old. It was held for him, but he pulled the trigger. He started to cry, and then being surrounded by men who thought that, expected him to act a bit tougher, he stopped himself. And he developed a lifelong interest in collecting firearms. Only the following year, in 1605, Marin le Bourgeois, the king's harquebusier, journeyed to Paris, possibly looking for a very sophisticated air gun for Louis, as well as to bring him another arquebus, which is, if you like, a type of long armour type of musket, a hunting horn and a crossbow. And his lifelong fascination with guns led to him being known as Louis l'Arquebusier. At the age of 10, he owned several revolver-type arquebuses, and by the age of 13, he owned 50. Other examples include Francesco de' Medici, who was a very precocious child and began to learn how to shoot a crossbow by the age of 4. Now, riding, of course, was an essential skill for anyone at the time to master, and remarkably, already at the age of 3 years old, the future Henry VIII, rode his first war horse down the streets of London, leading a, quote, goodly fellowship to his inauguration as Duke of York in 1494. In this particular image here from the Wallace Collection, we see Baltasar Carlos again. He's a fascinating character, from an arms and armour perspective because there are so many portraits of him wearing armour or using weapons. And it shows him at a riding school. He's about to be handed a lance. And again, for those of you in the room, I'm pointing to the tilt here. So he would charge down one side, his opponent would charge down the other, the barrier separating the two. And he's learning how to joust. Now, although by this period, this type of tournament, jousting, had really sort of started to give way in many courts to different types of horse trading, such as the caracol, such as the, I can't think of the name now. Anyway, they were still sort of seen as fundamental skills for a young boy to have, to master a horse and to know how to fight on horseback. And this lance of Philip of Castile at the bottom there, sorry, it's not easy to show a long brown stick on a slide, but he was only 12 years old when he was given that lance. Really, though, the most significant period in a boy's life, as I've already alluded to, is when he left the female household and entered a much more masculine world. And it was in this world that arms and armour would feature much more prominently. The age at which this occurred varied. Usually it was around 6. Louis XIII, Philip II and Henry VIII were 7, 8 and 11, respectively. During the Middle Ages, it's well known that boys of around the age of 6 were often sent away to join the household of another male relative or a member of the father's wider affinity or closely bonded network. And once their boys were exposed to an intensely chivalric and military-minded world in which they were trained to become warriors and leaders. And according to an early biographer of Charles V, his tutor, quote, read every day as an adolescent about the battles and victories of Caesar, Augustus, Charlemagne, Jason, Gideon, of ancient heroes, and of Dukes Philip and Charles of Burgundy, who were his great-grandfather and grandfather, respectively. Another well-known writer in the 14th century, Geoffrey de Charny, wrote that, quote, as soon as they begin to reach the age of understanding, again, that varies, but roughly 11 years old, although he's actually probably estimating that a bit too late. I think younger children than that would have been read stories. They like to hear and listen to men of prowess talk of military deeds, and to see men-at-arms with their weapons and armour, and enjoy looking at fine mounts and chargers. And as they increase in years, so they increase in prowess and skills in the arts of peace and war. And as they reach adulthood, the desire of their hearts grows ever to ride horses and bear arms. It's really important to note that boys learn not only to wear armour, how to use armour as a practical means of defence, but also how arms and armour could be used as part of the vocabulary of power. And one really important painting that shows this very well is this one of Charles V in Vienna. He's wearing an armour garlanded with the Imperial Order of the Golden Fleece, which again, for those in the room, I'm pointing to with the laser, and he's holding the sword aloft very much in the manner of a scepter, and there are echoes of that going back many hundreds of years and really into the late Roman period as well. So this painting is drawing on a long established tradition of regal and imperial iconography. In this painting, Charles is only 15 years old, but he appears every inch the ruler. It's unlikely that this armour was actually painted from life, as there are a number of details that are imprecise. It's therefore an idealised image. But that's certainly not to say that he didn't own a sword and armour like it. In fact, the armour is very similar in style to armours he would own later in life, so he probably did own something like this. The position of the sword really signifies a ruler's divinely ordained judicial authority, and the unsheathed sword, particularly, is a powerful statement of Charles's right to rule. Again, I talked about arms and armour being associated with specific milestones. In this case, The painting seems to have been painted on the eve of his majority and therefore his personal rule of the Burgundian Low Countries. Again, quoting from the Bible, which of course they would have known extremely well and been very conscious of when using images like this. From Deuteronomy, quote, "If I sharpen my glittering sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will render vengeance to my enemies and repay those who hate me." So looking at various milestones in a boy's life, this is probably the earliest portrait of a boy in armour, and it's that of Massimiliano Sforza, aged about 6. The painting was done by Giovanni Ambrogio de Predis in the late 15th century, and it occurs in a Ars Grammatica of the period. Now this portrait this book actually is extremely interesting because it not only shows Massimiliano in armour, it also depicts him at a banquet, at a triumphal procession, as a student, and seated between the figures of vice and virtue and trying to decide which one he's going to follow. Thus, the book is more a mirror of princes, a genre of didactic political writings providing instruction on personal behaviour and rulership. But what's particularly interesting is that the book also includes the image of his father, also in armour, and they're facing each other. Now, the image of the father does not occur on the facing page, it occurs towards the back of the book. But in essence, because the two figures are facing each other, it's as though the pages contained in the book are a dialogue between father and son on the nature of rulership. Now, it's possible that this book was commissioned, as I say, at the age of 6, when Massimiliano is entering into a more male-dominated world. But importantly, from his father's perspective, it also serves to legitimize the Duke's family and his line of succession, which was an important statement considering Ludovico was the 4th son and therefore not expected to inherit the dukedom. Again, both figures are in profile, echoing back to antique images of armoured heroes. And armour is very much associated with the legitimacy and the right and fitness to rule. So a number of armours belonging to boys of around 5 to 7 years of age survive across the world. And this one, belonging to Prince Philip of Castile, is the earliest surviving boy's armour. It was made in the Netherlands in about 1485. It's not complete. It originally would have included a helmet and armour for the arms and the legs. It was probably made because at the time Philip was Maximilian's only male heir, and therefore it was important that at any public events he appear as a worthy and importantly knightly successor and future sovereign of the Order of the Golden Fleece. What's particularly interesting about this armour is that the armour does indeed feature etched and gilt decoration of the golden fleece around his neck. Now, he had been bestowed that honour at the age of 2, whereas for all other men, they had to wait until adulthood. So this armour is really showing his preeminent status among other members of the order, and as I say, also his future leadership of that order. Unfortunately, Philip died in 1506. Instead, the throne went to Maximilian's grandson, Charles V. Another armour, which is particularly interesting because it has 2 lives, is that of Albert of Austria, Archduke of Austria. It was made when he was around 5 or 6 years of age by the renowned Augsburg armourer Anton Pfeffenhauser. It's believed that the armour was made for the coronation of his father, Emperor Maximilian II, in 1564, and much like the armoured figures of Massimiliano, which we saw a moment ago, the armour is designed to emphasise Albert's future role as a leader and emphasising Maximilian's lineage and by extension his virility and thus right to rule. For this armour and for all armours, we really have to see it under the banner of the son reflecting the glory of the father. So much like individuals, much like weapons associated with heroic individuals, armours too could be imbued with the same sense of mystique and potency. And it's interesting to note that Albert's armour was reused over a century later by Joseph Ferdinand of Bavaria, possibly in relation to his arrival in Brussels in 1698, when he received the oath of the States of Flanders. Albert of Austria, who the armour was made for, was previously sovereign of the Habsburg Netherlands, and so it's drawing on that tradition and Albert's legacy. But also he was nominated heir to the Spanish throne by the Treaty of The Hague, which would in very few years lead to the War of the Spanish Succession. So the Wallace Collection's armour, which is on the right there, and now it's on a new mount, and you can go and see it in Armoury 3 upstairs, fits into this group of armours being made for children around about 6 years of age as they enter a more masculine world. It's likely that it was made in France in the beginning of the 17th century, and much like the armour of Philip, it's incomplete. Originally, it would have comprised a helmet and probably shoulder defences, similar to the one at the Royal Armouries on your left. Again, it's not highly decorated. Armour doesn't have to be. You could have highly decorated armour for parades. You could have more functional and planar armours for the battlefield. So when children were provided with planar armours, it was to emphasise their future role on the battlefield, that these were boys preparing to go out and fight and not just sit on their horse and look impressive in a procession. So, as I've just mentioned, armours were not only made for display or to advertise the wearer and father's status, they were also used in combat. Now, while those made for particularly small children, like the 2-foot combat armours made in Augsburg in 1610, and there's one shown on the left there, possibly for the sons of Frederick William, Duke of Saxe-Altenburg, the armour would have been subjected to very light impacts. However, the armour on the right from the Detroit Institute of Arts shows that adolescents were subjected to and therefore hardened to violence. It was made in Italy in about 1605 for Cosimo de' Medici, the future Grand Duke of Tuscany. And unfortunately, I don't have any detailed images of it available, but you'll have to take my word that it sustained quite a lot of damage to the visor and the top of the helmet during the combat on foot at the barriers. Now, this type of tournament involved pairs or teams of contestants facing each other across a waist-high barrier. Hence, if I go back for a second, there's no armour for the legs. The aim was to strike blows using a pike, as we see here, or swords or other weapons. And engaging in tournaments, again, was very much part of a young man's training and formation of his identity. Renaissance Florence, for example, the tournament not only symbolised an individual's fitness to hold public office, both literally and metaphorically, it also served as an initiation into the ethical responsibilities of maturity, and therefore the tournament acted as a rite of passage. Now, hunting played a prominent role in the education of both boys and girls in the past, and in 1664, Gregorio Leti wrote that, "Since the hunt is the true image of war, because nothing can be found which more resembles the deeds of a brave warrior than the art of a good hunter, it is unlikely that a man can be a good captain on the battlefield without having been a good hunter." So consequently, teaching boys to hunt became a fundamental component of their education. And it has been observed in the literature that the hunted animal, in a way, stood in as a surrogate for the man who would later be hunted on the battlefield. Hunting not only taught a boy horsemanship and the use of weapons such as the bow, sword, and spear, but it also educated boys in strategy and gave them an appreciation of the importance of the terrain. Again, much like a tournament, hunting was very much seen as an initiation rite that hardened boys and importantly, forged strong lifelong male fellowships as part of a warrior elite. So the boys and men that he was out hunting with, he may later have been on the battlefield with. So it was extremely important not only to physically develop, but also form very strong bonds which you might have to rely on later on in life. Now, usually boys didn't start hunting until they were past the years of 7 or 8, although younger boys, including Federico Gonzaga, was 4 years old when he killed his first chicken with a miniature bow and arrow. Charles V was an avid huntsman by the age of 9, and he had been taught to shoot game with both the bow and firearms by his grandfather Maximilian. Charles's own son Philip followed his father's footsteps, and in fact he was so enthusiastic about killing animals that Charles had to establish a weekly quota saying which animals he could kill and how many of them. And if he wasn't out hunting, he was out hawking, and his tutor, Juan de Zuniga, reported that he greatly enjoyed shooting his crossbow, and when he wasn't doing that, he was out hawking. Quite a different impression from the later man, who became somewhat more secluded, well, very secluded, and really lost his interest in tournaments when he became older. So, some of these lessons which boys were being taught didn't always stick. They didn't always produce the man that their tutors desired. Very briefly, simply because there's been relatively little research into this field, it's a much neglected aspect, actually, of arms and armour study, and that is the role of women commissioning arms and armour, not for husbands, because that has been studied a bit, but for younger male relatives, and the extent to which women shaped a boy's masculinity. I think probably a lot of us are familiar with the quote from Plutarch, where Spartan mothers say to their sons, either come home with your shields or on them. Similar sentiments were also echoed by medieval writers. So the medieval poet Christine de Pizan, for example, urged the inculcation of military mentality into young boys in order to harden them up. The archetypal female warrior figure was, of course, Minerva, who Christine de Pizan calls the goddess of arms and chivalry, who actually invented armour to protect men's bodies. And there we see her handing out the arms and armour to knights in that manuscript illustration. Now, known examples of women commissioning arms and armour for their male relatives, relatively few, but I suspect that's with a bit more research, more examples will turn up. One interesting individual for whom his female relatives took a very prominent role in his life was Ferdinand Karl, who was the son of Leopold V, Archduke of Further Austria. In 1628, 10 days after his birth, he was sent a christening gift by his aunt, Maria Magdalena, Grand Duchess of Tuscany, and that was this armour on the left, which was made in around 1575. Now, interestingly, it was made for somebody else in 1575, and it was repurposed in 1628 as a christening gift. So it's somewhat old-fashioned. It wouldn't have been alien to anyone in the 17th century, but it's interesting, and I'm not entirely sure yet why that armour in particular was reused. However, the other major figure in his life was his mother, Claudia de' Medici, who took over the regency of Austria following her husband's death. Now, this armour dates to around 1635. It's brightly polished. In the Middle Ages, particularly, a brightly polished armour, again, was seen to reflect the purity and nobility of an individual's soul. This one has been attributed to Hans Frick, who was a court armourer, and he is also thought to have made another boy's armour, that of Claudia's younger son, Sigismund Franz, at the same time. Now, we don't know the precise reason for the manufacture of this armour, but it may simply have been to serve to bolster the position of both boys as the natural and rightful heirs of Leopold during their mother's regency. But it's important to say that women were not simply passive figures in this, who were only able to provide weapons and armour to their male relatives. They too were active users. Now, while women didn't wear armour, Elizabeth, for example, did not wear armour at Tilbury, even though you see it in the film. Catherine of Aragon, when she led the troops part of the way north to meet James IV in 1513, did not wear armour, despite what you see in the films. Women were avid enthusiasts of the crossbow and were also actually keen participants in the hunt, for which many male writers at the time praised them. So whereas boys and men tended to identify with great chivalric heroes of romance like Tristan, Gawain, Arthur and Percival, girls could find their model in Diana, goddess of the hunt. Elizabeth I, for example, particularly related to Diana, and she was portrayed as Diana in paintings, literature and songs of the period. And there are numerous women who are known to have loved hunting. Charles VII of France's mistress, Agnes Sorel, for example, Mary of Burgundy, her daughter, Margaret of Austria, learnt not only how to kill stags, but quite significantly, ritually undo them. That's dismember the body of the animal using specialized knives and tools. Now, this was an elaborate process which was suffused with Christian allegory and was usually expressed as part of elite masculinity. But in these cases, it's women taking on that role. In 1575, we know that Elizabeth I's hunting prowess so impressed the French ambassador that he wrote back that she had killed 6 does with her crossbow. Other individuals like Catherine Howard, Lady Berkeley, became proficient with the longbow, and in some rare instances, women such as Christine of Lorraine, who was the Grand Duchess of Tuscany, used firearms in place of the crossbow. And all of these would have been learnt in childhood. And it is into this world that we can place the Wallace Collection's crossbow. It's made of walnut, it's inlaid with horn and antler, which has been stained green, and is actually dated 1583, and it bears the inscription in French, "Pleasure passes wealth." Now, unfortunately, we don't know the identity of the original owner. It is English, so while it's unlikely, I'm certainly not going to claim that it was Elizabeth. It could quite comfortably have been used by one of her ladies in waiting when that lady was a child. Certainly its diminutive size, the floral decoration, and the fact that there's a medallion with a female head suggests it's highly likely that it belonged to a girl rather than a boy. Actually, in this image here, again, I'm using my laser pointer, you can see Queen Elizabeth preparing to slit the throat of the stag, and we know that was an activity that she undertook. Now, hunting or simply shooting the crossbow was certainly not a peripheral activity for women, but instead it was an important social and cultural practice which provided a convivial space for political dialogue and diplomacy away from the formality of court in London. We know that on hunting parties, Elizabeth sometimes invited noble courtiers such as Thomas Sackville, the Earl of Dorset, and his arm is actually upstairs in Arms and Armour 3. Henry Percy, the Earl of Northumberland, also accompanied her on hunting trips. And these provided informal opportunities for the Queen to converse with them and for her courtiers to raise any concerns with her without being overheard by a very competitive and jealous court. So it was thus an important part of a elite girl's education to become familiar with the crossbow. And from a very young age, when Elizabeth was at Hatfield, she would have watched and later participated in the numerous hunts that took place during the extensive parkland. So to conclude this rapid skip through, and there's a lot that I haven't been able to cover today, I thought I would take a brief look at this portrait by Eustace Thiel, who was the court painter to Philip II of Spain. Now, the portrait on the right is known as the Allegory of the Education of Philip III. And the young prince is depicted around the age of 12, following the deaths of his older brothers and his taking of the oath as Prince of Asturias at the church of San Jerónimo del Prado in Madrid in 1584. The armour he's wearing was actually a gift by the first Duke of Terranova a couple of years previously, and therefore the artist would have had to change the proportions of the armour, because as a 12-year-old boy, he would not have been able to fit into that armour anymore. And interestingly, as we move into the 17th century, we find that more and more in portraiture, that the proportions of armour are changed depending on the wearer's age. The armour itself is a Milanese parade armour made by Lucio Marliani, sometimes known as Piccinino, and it's rich in triumphal symbolism. It contrasted greatly with the previously restrained German style of armour that had been fashionable in the previous decades. And we actually have an armour by Piccinino upstairs, again in Arms and Armour 3, which is purely designed for parade. The armour is extremely thin, it's wafer thin. It would have been absolutely useless on the battlefield, but to take part in a triumphal procession, to present yourself in front of your future subjects, the swearing of an oath, or indeed the betrothal to a girl from another noble or royal family, you could wear extremely decorative armour that was replete with triumphal and allegorical symbolism. Interestingly, you will notice that he is not wearing the helmet that belongs to this armour. Instead, he is wearing a different helmet, but the helmet that he is wearing still closely configures to the iconography on the rest of the armour. The decoration of the armour itself alludes to the moral uprightness of the wearer. So we have medallions of Minerva, Jupiter, Mars, fortitude, prudence, justice, and temperance. Notably, Philip also rests his left hand on the hilt of a rapier, which in the words of one French writer, François Dancier, in 1623 was, quote, the finest plume of a great man, and also Vincenzo Saviolo in 1595 said, it showeth who are men of arms and honour. So that essentially wraps up what I've got to say today. I hope that you found it interesting. I hope that I've shown that arms and armour were a fundamental part of childhood and really played a very prominent role in shaping their identities later as warriors. There's a lot more research that needs to be done. It's still somewhat of a neglected subject, but it's a fascinating subject, and once you scratch the surface, you really do see so many things coming out to the fore. So thank you very much.